As you know, I spend a lot of time covering the civilizations of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, most of which has been focused on Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. However, to the west of these lie the Zagros Mountains, which extend for 1,600 kilometers, or nearly 1,000 miles, from the southern deserts of Iran to southwestern Anatolia. While most of this mountain range lies within the confines of western and southern Iran, smaller but significant parts also extend beyond the Iranian border into Iraq and Turkey. Unlike with most of Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze and early Iron Age history of this region, at least until the advent of the Achaemenid Empire, has not been studied in as much detail. This has given many the impression that not much was going on here during the early years of antiquity. On the contrary, due to many of the artifacts that have been discovered throughout the Zagros range, a lot was going on in this region before it became part of the Achaemenid Empire. Unfortunately, the people who lived here didn't have any known form of writing, and so we can only make informed assumptions of what their lives may have been like from the relatively few ruins and artifacts that have been uncovered. In fact, the only writing about the peoples inhabiting these mountains comes from the literate civilizations just to the east in Mesopotamia. Some of the earliest Sumerian texts between 2900 to 2500 BC seem to indicate that resources such as copper, tin, and precious stones came from the region of the Zagros Mountains and beyond. A few centuries later, most notably during the reign of the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, between the years 2254 to 2218 BC, we get the names of a few tribes that lived there, the most famous being the Lulubi, who were ruled by a king named Satuni. Believed to have come from the Zagros Mountains, they're depicted on the famous victory stela of Naram-Sin. In general, the urban dwellers of ancient Mesopotamia looked down upon the inhabitants of the mountains along their eastern borders as a great nuisance. The Lulubi were one such people, and Naram-Sin may have been punishing them for their attacks on what was at the time the frontiers of the Akkadian Empire. Interestingly, later Neo-Sumerian and Babylonian texts traditionally attribute the end of the Akkadian Empire to another mountain people, the Gutians. In the Neo-Sumerian literary work, The Curse of Agade, written a few centuries after the reign of Naram-Sin, the Gutians are described as a people who know no inhibitions, with human instincts, but canine intelligence, and monkey's features. Whether or not the Gutians actually brought about the downfall of Akkadian civilization in the Dark Age that followed is hotly debated amongst scholars. But virtually all Sumerian and Babylonian texts describe them using derogatory words. Another group believed to have come from the Zagros Mountains were the Kassites. First entering Mesopotamia as migrant workers, by the 16th century BC, a Kassite dynasty had established itself as the rulers of most of Babylonia. In power for around 400 years, the Kassites ruled over Babylon and the nearby cities longer than any other dynasty. And yet, we know little about them or their mountain ancestors. In fact, no artifact that can be definitively identified as being Kassite has ever been found in their homeland, whichever part of the Zagros Mountains that may have been. The same mysteries seem to also be true of the many Iron Age peoples and kingdoms that appear in the annals of later Assyrian kings. The names of some of them found in these texts, most of which would be unknown to us otherwise, include the Mania, Ilipi, Gilzanu, Mada, and Parsua. Based on information from the Assyrian archives, listing tribute or spoils of war from military campaigns against them, these people had horses, livestock, camels, and objects crafted out of copper, bronze, silver, gold, and lapis lazuli. However, because none of these peoples, or the small states they formed, left behind any discernible form of writing, we can only guess at their exact locations due to what little is mentioned of them in Assyrian texts. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Assyrian records barely reveal the tip of the iceberg. There have been many different cultures living in this region, dating back several thousand years. In this program, we'll delve deeper into the little-known history of these mysterious peoples who once occupied the Zagros Mountains. Though the earliest presence of humans in western Iran goes back to the Paleolithic era, we are going to jump forward in time to around 5000 to 4000 BC, which was during the Chalcolithic or Copper Age. It's at sites such as Haji Firuz Tepe, Dalma Tepe, Yanik Tepe, Tepegian, Godin Tepe, Ganj Dare, and a few other sites that archaeologists uncovered distinct styles of painted pottery and small figurines dating back to at least 7,000 years ago. Covered with images of various geometric patterns and animals, especially the ibex and various birds, they show some semblance to artifacts dated to around the same period in northern Mesopotamia, indicating the movement of peoples between that area and the mountains of western Iran. This type of pottery would be the main form of artistic expression in much of the Zagros Mountains for the next few millennia. Many of these sites also contained copper tools such as chisels and axes. By around 3000 BC, small, button-shaped stamp seals became relatively common amongst several prehistoric sites throughout the Zagros range. Since we know that such seals were used throughout the Near East to authenticate goods and their sender, this may indicate some form of regional trade, most likely with Mesopotamia to the west and the lowlands of Elam to the south. One site of interest was Godin Tepe, where clay tablets with Proto-Elamite markings have been uncovered. It's even been hypothesized that a Proto-Elamite trading post may have existed in or around Godin Tepe. Between 2500 to 2000 BC, around the time that most of western Iran entered into the Bronze Age, several of the known early Copper Age sites were still occupied, but evidence suggests that people from the north migrated into this region and transformed many of these earlier settlements in the process. The new arrivals are called by scholars the Transcaucasian Bronze Age culture, also sometimes known as the Yanik culture, and their influence can be seen in the new types of pottery and housing layouts that appear in some parts of northwestern Iran. Though there's little evidence of any violence during their migration, their arrival in the region coincides with the eventual abandonment of some sites, such as Yanik Tepe, after which the culture was actually named. Other areas, though, either didn't come in contact with such people or maintained their original culture, such as the people of Godin Tepe, which remained occupied until at least 1400 BC. Another notable late Bronze Age site that seems to have been occupied for extended periods of time into the early Iron Age is Dinka Tepe, located in northwestern Iran near Lake Urmia, or Urmiye. There, archaeologists working from the 1930s to the 60s discovered that there had once been a massive fortification wall, perhaps dating to the Bronze Age, over which a later Iron Age settlement had been built. Burials with grave goods, mostly pottery, but also weapons such as spears and daggers, were discovered throughout the site. What's unique about the Iron Age settlement is that the older style of pottery and ceramic ware, which is similar to the style found throughout northern Mesopotamia, is almost completely replaced with another kind typical of northern Iran, southwestern Anatolia, and the southern Caucasus region. This new type of pottery, which started to appear at sites such as Dinka Tepe between 1000 to 900 BC, was unique for the shape of its sprouted vessels and pedestal-based goblets with side handles. The change is stark and seems to imply that, like at Yanik Tepe centuries earlier, a new culture had arrived at Dinka Tepe and the nearby site of Haji Firuz. It's also more evidence of constant migration and change taking place throughout western Iran in antiquity. Just to the east of Dinka Tepe is the site of Hassanlou Tepe, or simply Hassanlou. Of all the early Iron Age sites, Hassanlou is one of the most impressive, and perhaps also the most tragic. One summer day, around 800 BC, just south of what's today Lake Urmia in Iran, a hostile army appeared on the edges of a moderately sized city. What its name was so long ago is unknown, but today the locals called the mound covering its present-day ruins Hassanlou Tepe. Within the city were temples, the homes of its citizens, a palace, and a citadel. However, most of these buildings had been abandoned. The vast majority of the city's residents had fled to the great citadel, hoping that its strong walls would protect them from the invaders. They wouldn't. When the walls were finally breached, the hapless people trapped inside were greeted by a barrage of arrows, followed by the slashes of swords and stabbing from spears. Perhaps when there were few left to slaughter, the invading soldiers set the citadel on fire, which, due to the hot summer wind fanning its flames, quickly spread throughout the entire complex. The wooden columns holding up the ceiling began to disintegrate amongst the flames, and eventually, the entire ceiling crashed, crushing those who may have thought they were safe within the parts of the citadel that had yet to be breached. But the invading soldiers had acted too hastily, for they didn't realize that within the temples and citadel there were valuable objects made of bronze, silver, and gold. A few days later, after the fires had all but died down, some of the enemy soldiers seemed to have returned and searched through the ash and rubble for more objects to loot. Loading whatever they found that could be carried on their pack animals, they eventually left, leaving behind at least 285